Welcome to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, sponsored by opednews.com, available on Stitcher and Progressive Radio Network and Pacifica Radio. My guest for this show is Lisa Yaszek. She's professor of science fiction studies in the School of Literature, Media, and Communication at Georgia Tech, where she researches and teaches science fiction as a global language crossing centuries, continents, and cultures. She's particularly interested in issues of gender, race, and science and technology in science fiction across media, as well as the recovery of lost voices in science fiction history and the discovery of new voices from around the globe. Her books include The Self-Wired, Technology and Subjectivity in Contemporary American Narrative, Galactic Suburbia, Recovering Women's Science Fiction, Sisters of Tomorrow, The First Women of Science Fiction. Her newest book, just out, is The Futurist Female, 25 Classic Science Fiction Stories by Women, from Pulp Pioneers to Ursula K. Le Guin. And I discovered Lisa's work from watching James Cameron's Story of Science Fiction, in which she wrote the chapter on time travel. So welcome to the show.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here, Rob.
So I hope you're right that the future will be more female. Because we need more elected officials and CEOs who are female, and so that's where I am anyway. So you research and teach fiction as a global language, science fiction as a global language crossing centuries, continents, and cultures. What does that mean?
So I'm really interested in science fiction as not just a story form. Of course, as a story form, it's a marvelous story form, but as the way we really talk to each other about our experiences with science and technology and our hopes and fears for the future. In my experience, it doesn't matter where you go around the globe or who you talk to, young, old, black, white, pink, purple, green, human, alien, whatever. Everyone has an opinion about science fiction. There's always something we can talk about. It's truly one of the few things I think that we have that's a kind of common global culture. And it's exciting to look at that and see what it is we've been telling each other and the stories we tell each other about the future.
How big is the business of science fiction?
Well, that depends what part of it you're talking about, right? People often call science fiction the golden ghetto, but the reality is, because it's a popular form of literature, so in theory, it's a ghettoized form of literature, but there are always a few breakout examples of people who've done very, very well financially. But, overall, depending on what you talk about, obviously, as if you talk about movies, and especially Hollywood movies, science fiction is big business, right? I mean, most blockbusters from Hollywood and also increasingly from Bollywood and Nollywood, you're seeing are science fiction movies. But when it
Nollywood? What's Nollywood?
Yeah, that's the film industry coming out of Nigeria.
Nigeria.
Yeah.
Hollywood's
absolutely.
India, of course. Well, I know that a single science fiction movie can generate over $1 billion in sales. And
absolutely.
George Lucas sold Lucasfilms to Disney for over $4 billion. So
Right.
It's a big business.
Yeah, absolutely. And Lucas is a great example because he's really one of the people who made it a big business. He was the first director to keep merchandising rights on his characters. And obviously that's done very, very well for him. I mean, if you think about it, Lucas has only directed, I think, 6 films in his life. Really, so much of what we get is, what he's brought us in terms of special effects and Skywalker Studios. And it's really a whole package. Yeah. So it gets to be huge business like that. But meanwhile, print science fiction authors, they're not maybe making the millions of dollars that we see like a Ridley Scott or a George Lucas making. I think when you get down to that level, a lot of people have to still keep their day jobs. So it's not really quite as big of a business. I mean, I think it's a big business in that there are publishing houses and imprints with science fiction, but there's definitely a wide variety of ways to participate in the genre and different amounts of money or other kinds of capital to be made.
Well, I know a new way to participate is with Netflix and Amazon Prime. A friend of mine has a Netflix series coming out. Jonathan Mayberry's got V-Wars coming out soon.
Oh, very cool.
And
excellent.
He's thrilled. And there's comic books. And comic books I think are still a vital part of science fiction, aren't they?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And it's from the very beginning, comic book and science fiction authors moved back and forth between the genres. And I think you really see that today if you think about the Marvel Infinity War movies, right? I mean, they're comic book movies, but they're so science fictional, especially when you're doing the Guardians of the Galaxy part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you've focused a lot on some of the less visible voices, the women, people of color.
Yeah.
And you talk a little bit about that.
Sure.
How have women played a role in science fiction? How have their voices affected our culture?
Sure. Yeah, well, first of all, it's funny, right? Today we enjoy lots of women writers. I think many of us grew up reading like Ursula K. Le Guin or Madeleine L'Engle. Today, of course, recently N.K. Jemisin, Nora Jemisin, won the Hugo Award. Actually, she's the first author of any sex or race to win 3 Hugo Awards in a row. So very impressive work that's happening, right? So we're really seeing right now women who are cultural leaders. Think about even the popularity of A Wrinkle in Time. It wasn't maybe the blockbuster that Star Wars was, but lots of people went and saw it and enjoyed it. And that's a story not just about women, but written by women as well. And directed by a woman, of course. So now we enjoy lots of women in science fiction. And of course, I think a lot of us would easily acknowledge that Mary Shelley was the mother of science fiction. But then the question becomes...
Well, talk a little bit about her.
Okay,
Mary
sure.
Shelley. When did
Mary
she write
Shelley.
it? And what did she write?
Absolutely. So this year is the Bicentennial of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. It was first published in 1818.
200 years ago.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's great, right? Because it's the story that, first of all, it was the first commercially successful science fiction story. I mean, it did wildly well, not so much because of its critique of science, but because of its sort of gothic, grotesque parts that people were really into. But it was wildly popular. It was made into dramas right away, and obviously today there are how many film interpretations and comic book interpretations and novelizations of Frankenstein. There's even a fairly new book out called Frankenstein in Baghdad, and I'm forgetting the name of the author right now, but it takes place during the sort of current wars in the Middle East. And it's about a man who is just sort of unhinged or maybe rehinged by the war and goes around and starts sewing body parts back together around the city in hopes of somehow bringing some order, I guess, to a disordered world. So Mary Shelley's work has been really powerful. And I think that in part it's been, of course, because she gave us the vocabulary to talk about science and society, right? She gave us the mad scientist. She gave us the misunderstood creature. She even gave us the love interest who gets killed off because all the men are fighting. Not maybe the best part of the whole story, but she's making a point there too, right? About what happens when women don't have any influence in society or on the course of science. And, we've loved that story and we tell it and tell it and tell it again. And then, like I said, today we also celebrate a number of contemporary women writers. So then the question is, what happened in between 1818 and let's say like 1965 when Le Guin starts publishing? Like, where were all the women? Did they go away? And I was really curious about this. And I got interested in doing research on it when I was putting together a class on science fiction. And I thought, I don't want to teach the same 15 men we keep teaching again and again. And I started going through old anthologies. And I was shocked. There were so many women in the old anthologies and people seemed to really like their work and celebrate it. And I thought, where is this history gone? We don't seem to know that history anymore. And so I've been really excited to bring that back and to show people how women have always participated in helping us dream about the future.
It was really fun to learn that Leslie F. Stone inspired Isaac Asimov to start writing science fiction. That was pretty cool.
That was cool. Now, I'm not sure that that Asimov would have known. She was female. He came into the... When Stone started publishing, her picture was often published with her stories. That was common practice in the first few years of science fiction. But Asimov was really, really young. So when he came in, I don't even know if he knew she was a man or a woman, but I love that he loved her stories. I think that's great. And it's cool because the story that really inspired him is called The Human Pets of Mars. And it's about a group of humans who are abducted by aliens, by Martians. And they realize the only way they're going to get home is if they put away all their stereotypes of each other and let each person rise to be what they really can be. So they have to stop assuming that like the white guy politician is going to lead the day because he turns out to be useless. And instead, it's the society matron. She's the only person who knows how to manage people. And so she gets them organized. And then it turns out the only person who can fly the spaceship is the black janitor who everyone had dismissed as kind of uneducated. And it turns out he's great with technology. So it's exciting. And you can see where that inspired Asimov because he so much wanted to change our ideas about what robots were and how we could use science and technology to build better futures.
So what is the role of science fiction in our culture?
I think the
small
role,
question.
I know, right. I actually think, though, there's a pretty simple answer. I think science fiction teaches us how to dream, and it teaches us how to dream differently, right? Science fiction is ostensibly about other worlds and alien peoples and distant pasts or distant futures, but in many ways it's really just a funhouse mirror, a reflection of ourselves, right? And so science fiction can help us see our own present differently. It can help us understand how our present is different from the past and how humans have been involved in creating those changes. And it gives us permission to imagine how we might get involved again and change both the material world and the social world to build different futures. And that seems so exciting, especially because we live in a cultural moment where we're so often told, by the media, by politicians, maybe even by our friends and families, that this is the best possible moment and this is the best future you can hope for. And science fiction says there's always other futures. And that can be really exciting and liberating. Even if you maybe like where you think the future is headed, why not explore other ones and see if there's not something even better out there?
And this is the Rob Call Bottom Up Show. I'm going to pause for a moment so when I'm editing, I can get the sound silence. And my guest for this show is Lisa Yaszek. She's the author of a new book, The Future is Female. And that excites me. I mean, you've written, I think, before this book about a future without patriarchy.
Yeah, I've explored stories that have done that. Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah. So what does that look like? What do they tell us?
Well, there's lots of different futures that could exist without patriarchy. Again, there are so many. I think one of the main things you'll often see, especially in feminist utopias, which I think are the most direct responses to patriarchy and are often stories about women literally leaving patriarchy behind and building new systems. Often what you'll see in those is not necessarily just an emphasis on women as peaceful. They often avoid stereotypes like that. And in fact, what's fascinating to me is how many feminist utopias are built on violence, that women have to take up arms and do something often to get out of whatever bad society they're in and build their new futures. But then you really see this emphasis on interpersonal cooperation and a sort of respect for and engagement with the earth, rather than a sort of attempt to master and just make it yield and produce.
I love that because, I've got my book on bottom up coming out.
Right, yeah.
I think that those are very bottom up ways of seeing and interacting with the world and with other people.
Yeah.
So I like that.
Yeah. And
on the other hand, you've got a show like Black Panther, and it's like you described, it's a lot of violence in it.
Yeah, absolutely. And Black Panther is such an interesting example because a lot of women have really embraced it because it does have a number of really powerful women represented in it. Most importantly, Shuri, Black Panther's sister, who's a scientist and even a little bit of a mad scientist, which is cool because women don't always get to play the mad scientist. They're usually the victims of the mad scientist. But she's also, of course, a heroic scientist. She builds for the community. But at the same time, the Black Panther stories, they're constant cycles of violence. It's always about how can T'Challa be both king and a superhero? And if he tries to be a superhero, someone else takes over as king. And then there has to be a big fight and another revolution. It becomes, the same thing again and again. Now, having said that, it's not that women can't write about violence as well. And I certainly wouldn't want to say that, men are inherently violent and women are not. But often the expressions of violence, well, there certainly is some of that going on, but women are certainly capable of violence. Ask anyone who's ever known Mean Girls, for instance, right? But I do think, but you will see women talk about taking up arms, going to war, et cetera, things like that, and sometimes even against each other if they are not ideologically aligned in their science fiction. But there's a certain sense, I'm thinking about even in space operas by women where there is a lot of violence, there's also a lot of creativity and birth and generation. My favorite is there's a new book out by Cameron Hurley. I'm forgetting the name of it right now, but in this world, women give birth to everything, like from babies to starship parts. And it's pretty exciting, actually. So very, very different of what the future, vision of what the future could look like, a sort of closeness, not maybe just with the earth, but also with our machines.
Women have become digital 3D printers there.
Yeah. Actually, I just taught a story about something about that, and all of my students were like, this is my future. I don't know if that was a good or a bad thing, but it's something to write about, and it's something people really respond to. Yeah.
Now, there's a lot of science fiction that revolves around apocalypse and the end of the world now.
Yes, yes.
What's about that?
Yeah, well, we've been in a pretty apocalyptic moment for a while. You see a real spike in dystopias after World War II, in large part because this is the first time Americans have really seen science and technology not work out the way they had anticipated, with the fallout, both literal and social, from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So you begin to see, as authors begin to write anti-war science fiction novels, you'll certainly begin to see that kind of dystopic writing. And dystopias have become increasingly important through the 70s and 80s and on through today. We often talk about modern dystopias as being
wait. What I asked you about apocalyptic. You're
apocalyptic. Sorry,
dystopia. Yeah. That's fine, but what is it?
Sure.
What is a dystopia? Yeah. How is that different from apocalyptic?
All right. So a dystopia is the opposite of a utopia. So if a utopia is the good society that isn't anywhere, that is sort of a blueprint or a dream in our minds, the dystopia is the opposite of that. It's the bad society, the worst place we can dream up. And again, it becomes a reflection of our own fears about the world. And that often, you can have dystopias about anything. The Handmaid's Tale is a wonderful example of a dystopia that a lot of people are watching right now. And often dystopias are linked to apocalypse. A dystopian culture could lead to apocalypse. Some sort of technological apocalypse might allow for a dystopia to emerge. So for instance, I think The Handmaid's Tale is another good example. The sort of background event that allows that religious organization to take over America is a sort of apocalyptic event that it seems like there's a decline, a rapid decline in birth, and the population is dropping very quickly. And that becomes the excuse to build the dystopic society. So sometimes the apocalypse can cause the dystopia, but I think another reason we like apocalyptic stories is they let us wipe the slate clean. They become a way to imagine something different. And this is something that H.G. Wells initiated, this idea that you could tell a story about a world that blows itself up, but then the few brave, strong, proud remnants would then rebuild maybe a saner and better society. Often, I think when we tell apocalyptic stories today, we just take it to the edge of the apocalypse. We never see the better society get built. But in some ways, I wonder if that's not because these stories are inviting us to go and build this, that they're warning stories, that they say, if things go on the way they are, we will have an apocalypse of some sort, whether it's environmental, whether it's nuclear arms kind of apocalypse, whether it's something else, maybe a zombie apocalypse, who knows, right? In science fiction, it could be any of these things.
Are there patterns of apocalyptic visions that you've identified?
Yeah, apocalyptic visions tend to map with what are our major sciences and technologies at the moment. So around World War I, you see a lot of apocalypses involving toxic clouds, gas clouds, and things like that. Obviously, extrapolating from concerns both about toxic atmospheres, just industrial pollution, but also, of course, nerve gas and mustard gas and things that were used in World War I. After World War II, a lot of stories about nuclear war, and those we continue to see those today, although they're not quite as prominent. I think recently we've seen more environmental apocalypse in science fiction, and that's something that we're obviously very concerned about right now in an era of factory farming and thinking about genetic modification of foods and the ways foods are distributed.
And I would guess like biotechnology stuff too, and now you've also explored AI, artificial intelligence, as well.
Yeah.
And of course, James Cameron did the Terminator series.
Yes.
One of the most successful movie series that is based on AI, basically.
Yeah, right. So AI stories, we have a lot of stories where we worry that our machines will bring us to the brink of apocalypse. And we see that again, beginning maybe in the 60s and 70s with movies like Colossus, the Forbin Project, which is about a Soviet computer and an American computer deciding that humans are the problem that cause war. So they join together to solve that problem. It's a pretty brutal movie, actually. But then, of course, someone like Cameron really brings that to our attention with Terminator. Today, I think we have more sympathy for our artificial intelligences now. We don't see as many of these kind of rampaging robots or systems out of control. So I'm thinking about a movie like Ex Machina, right? Where a man builds an artificial intelligence, builds several female artificial intelligences, and then uses them as sex slaves, essentially, and eventually one fights back. So whereas earlier you have things like the Terminator, these big male scary machines that I think sort of represent the war machine and sort of all of our anxieties about technologically enabled aggression, we have these new movies like Ex Machina where we're invited to sympathize with the AI. Neil Blomkamp did a wonderful one too called Chappie, actually, where we're invited to see artificial intelligences as ourselves, I think, as victims of certain kinds of technological manipulation and social and economic abuse. And when they fight back, it's inspiring that we can fight back too. So we're seeing changes, definitely.
I've written in the past that the science fiction has predicted that our technology will will turn against us,
Mm-hmm.
and inventions of humans will turn against us. And I've written that they already have, and they are corporations.
Right.
I think there we are in the midst of a huge situation where they've kind of gotten out of control. And I don't know that there's that much writing about that, unfortunately.
Well, there's a whole strain of cyberpunk of science fiction called cyberpunk that does indeed take this on.
Oh, really?
Yeah, absolutely. So cyberpunk became popular in the 1980s. It's this kind of science fiction that imagines near futures where the environment is trashed, but we also haven't made it into space for a variety of reasons. National governments give way to either corporate control or gang control, and there's very little difference between the two. You have humans often sort of jostling and competing for survival, not just with other humans, but with modified humans, cyborgs, artificial intelligences, robots, even aliens sometimes. And these are stories that they begin with Blade Runner, I think is a good place to start. William Gibson's Neuromancer in print is the big book that's often considered as really starting the genre. But Gibson himself said that Blade Runner, he had to leave Blade Runner because he said it felt like what he was writing in his head. And that's a movie that does a great job of showing you the way corporations manipulate people and objects, right? I mean, the whole point of the movie eventually is that it doesn't matter if you're a human or a robot. We're all slaves to the Tyrell Corporation. And it's coming to that realization that becomes important. And that's where I think science fiction gives us a way to think through these kinds of corporate entities and the way they move things around. And it's exciting to see how often in these stories, they're often about little people who are trying to come to some realization, or come to a realization that the system is not right. And they try to make lives better for themselves. And increasingly, the first generation of cyberpunk was really pessimistic and just thought there's no way we're getting out of this hole. But I think as time went on and we realized we could indeed live through these technological shifts, and that cyberpunk's become more optimistic, and it looks now for ways that people can realize the conditions of their existence and connect with each other and make change, either small changes to make their own lives better, or sometimes even bigger changes in the structures of their communities and their governments even.
Are there cyberpunk authors that you would recommend?
Yes, there are. I still think William Gibson is absolutely one of the best people for thinking through, especially the impact of corporations on individuals. We have a tendency, especially like in Hollywood science fiction, to want to blame our science and technology for the problems rather than the way they're used, often for profit and not for the benefit of humanity. Cyberpunk does a really good job addressing both the promises and perils of these futures. It certainly shows how people get moved around, literally like cogs in a machine, but it also dreams that as our technology becomes closer to us, that we can find ways to use it in different and more meaningful ways. I think Pat Cadigan is another author who does this wonderfully. She was one of the original cyberpunks and often is considered one of the only women in the first group. Misha Noga was the other woman. She's also wonderful. Indigenous Misha Noga. She's an Indigenous American cyberpunk writer, and she weaves together Indigenous mythologies with cyberpunk realities. Very exciting stuff. Very, very weird. And what she explores and what Pat Cadigan explore are the ways that we can create networks that are maybe under the radar, that are outside these big structures, outside of capitalism, outside of these corporate relations or gang relations, or at least that move through them, but aren't totally defined by them.
Interesting. I just at a conference on peace and justice studies, and they were presenting on how they were looking at some research on hidden resistance, which by its definition is hard to study. I interviewed James Scott, who wrote a book about it, but it sounds like what you're describing there.
Exactly. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And think about someone like Nalo Hopkinson, who's a Jamaican Canadian author, also made her name writing cyberpunk in the 90s, does all kinds of stuff now, is a leading figure in Afrofuturism and Black speculative fiction. And she really thinks about how it is that even as we're engaging technologies, new digital technologies, new communication technologies, we can use stories from the past. And in particular, of course, she pulls on Jamaican and Caribbean mythology to reshape those technologies in more benign ways for the future and in ways that will really benefit everyone.
Well, speaking of technology, I fell in love with the hero's journey, and I've had a lot of fun exploring that. Had Chris Vogler, author of The Writer's Journey, on as a guest to explore the idea that most stories are told with a hero. Yeah. A big, powerful person, male or female. And I around the time of Occupy, I started thinking about why not have a group of people, a network, a collective of people as a hero. Yeah. Are there any like that you know of?
Well, I think there is. I mean, if you think about it, science fiction, again, it's a genre that's uniquely poised to imagine a collective hero, because often it can be about the single individual, great man or great woman saving society, but it can also be about collective action and about groups working together. You see this especially in print science fiction, often that you have stories about brave people putting aside their differences and working together to build a future. Better future. And those stories really depend on that kind of collective action. I think to a certain extent, Star Trek wants to give us a vision of that future. It's really hard when you have very dynamic actors like William Shatner or any of the later actors either, because they just so want to take over. But you really when I think about the Starship Enterprise, I think about that group of men and women on the bridge, not just Kirk. I think about Uhura and Chekhov and everyone else. And that's true for really all the Star Treks. I think it tries. Also, Kim Stanley Robinson is a wonderful author, contemporary author, who does a marvelous job writing contemporary utopias, for one thing. And in a world where you see so much dystopic fiction, it's so refreshing to read about people trying to build utopia. And he really tries to imagine it as a collective process. So for instance, his Mars trilogy, which is a series of 3 books from the 1990s about colonizing and terraforming Mars, very dramatic, 3,000 pages of people talking and talking and talking about what might be the best kind of political system. And then, of course, something happens and they have to put all their talk to the test and see, well, can we really use these different kinds of structures to preserve our autonomy from Earth or to make ourselves a real trading presence in the universe? And it's fascinating to see him try to dramatize not just one group of people coming together with one idea, but many groups of people coming together with lots of different ideas about utopia and recognizing that they're never going to agree, except that they can agree to try to agree. And I think that's beautiful and exciting. And he manages to tell it in a dramatic way. The story begins with the murder of the guy you think is going to be the hero and ends with humans getting wings and flying. Like, how awesome is that?
Well, I think one of the things that you talk about in your books about women science fiction writers is that they bring a different dimension. You describe how they brought more character development to science fiction. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and women have always prided themselves on bringing character development into science fiction. It's something that we see authors talking about from the 1920s and 30s forward. Originally, and even today, science fiction is a literature of ideas. It's very much about playing with what if. What if we take a science in this direction? What if we develop society this way? Then what happens next? And so historically, characters were often relegated to a kind of secondary status. It was the big ideas and the setting for the big ideas that was important. What is the idea and how do you build a world around it? Characters really initially were often just vehicles for those big ideas. So characters would represent very flat types. The heroic use of science, the selfish engineer, the bad capitalist, the powerful alien queen. And these are types we know, and we still kind of love them. We still see them in movies and comics and video games today. But you can only go so far with a character type like that. It's fun, but there's not a lot of emotional connection to it. And women have been really good at bringing in character types and using that to sort of force readers to emotional connections with some of the points they're making. So, for instance, from the very beginning, women, they had to fight the fact that there were really only one or two ways to write about women in science fiction. There was the love interest and the evil alien queen. So it was up to women to come up with some other ideas about what might women be like in the future. And of course, they extrapolated from their own lives, and you get everything from heroic engineers to brave astronauts to desperate housewives, essentially. And you end up with a world of women. The other thing that women did that they were very smart about was, from the beginning, editors encouraged authors to make the genre new and exciting by drawing on the best of other genres and bringing it into science fiction and blending them together. And so what you often see is that women drew on complex character types out of other forms of fiction, modes of fantasy, and a lot of women's domestic fiction from the 19th century. And women invented a lot of new character types, and then they bring them with them into science fiction, like sensitive scientists who actually appreciate women for their minds as well as their bodies, characters like that. And women who are villains as well as heroes. I think we don't want to just put women on a pedestal and say, because that's another way of limiting people, right? We want to sort of explore their full being. And that's something that women science fiction authors have been very interested in doing, both for themselves and also for men and for non-binary people as well.
So what about period science fiction or fantasy? Game of Thrones. Is Game of Thrones science fiction?
Well, not yet. If winter ever comes, then it will be science fiction, right? Right now, winter is just a metaphor, but I think once winter shows up and they actually have to prepare, then maybe it'll be a science fiction story. But they're closely related genres, science fiction and fantasy. They are both genres that are escapism, and I mean that in the best of all possible ways. They take us out of our world, and when they return us to our world, they do so, we're refreshed and we can look at our world from a new perspective. And both science fiction and fantasy really have the opportunity to do that for us. I certainly think Game of Thrones is a wonderful example. It's a fantastic mirror to our own society, right? Winter is coming in the land of Game of Thrones, right? And we know that there's a zombie apocalypse right behind that wall headed towards everyone. And the humans know it too, but they can't stop fighting with each other, and they keep sort of carrying on their weird little petty political fights, even though there's this gigantic disaster coming that they should really be banding against. And if that's not human nature in a nutshell, or at least the way we see it right now playing out across the world, I don't know what is.
Now, when I was a kid, I read every science fiction book about cavemen. In the library.
Yeah.
Now, that's not modern science, but I always thought of it as science fiction. I mean, Gina Oel had not written her stuff yet, but I had read everything that I could find because it fascinated me. I mean, and since now, I guess I'm interested in anthropology.
Right. Yeah.
But would that be considered science fiction, looking at cavemen and the way they live?
Well, it could be if it sort of fits, if it plays the game of science fiction, if it's logically extrapolated from what we currently know to be true or what we believe to be true about history, and if you can build a plausible world. And I think the key thing is it's science fiction if it's got new things that are scientific and technological in it, right? Otherwise, you're right, it's historical fantasy. And that's wonderful, or a period drama. But to make it be science fiction, it needs to really be about the way you'd want to explore how did cave people, what did they do with science and technology? What were their contributions towards what we might call modern civilization? And I think Jean Auel does that really well in the Clan of the Cave Bear books. Her heroine is always inventing things. She invents everything from like horse harnesses to tampons. It's amazing. That woman is like a scientific dynamo. And I remember thinking that was really cool when I was a kid. So I think that
there was Edgar Rice Burroughs. I think I read everything he wrote back when I was a teenager. And he wrote Tarzan. He wrote the Martian stories.
The John Carter of Mars books, right? Yes.
And he wrote the Lost World.
Yes.
So he kind of crossed. Now, some of it is science fiction, some of it isn't, or what?
Yeah, I mean, science fiction is a big tent, right? And these are marketing categories at some level, right? That every time, this always happens when I teach science fiction at Georgia Tech, and my classes are full of engineers. If you give them a definition, they'll find a dozen examples that don't fit your definition, right? So I think we want to be sort of flexible about these. And a lot of authors work across genres. That's very, very common. Science fiction authors often write fantasy. A lot of women science fiction writers also write romance novels. And science fiction writers of all sexes and genders also write pornography of all weird things. But maybe, again, other worlds, alien encounters, who knows? But it's common. Also, you don't make a lot of money. I mentioned earlier, science fiction is like a golden ghetto. So you got to write what you can write. But yeah, absolutely. Someone like Edgar Rice Burroughs was writing across all those genres. And that early in the 20th century, the genres weren't very firmly in place yet as marketing categories. That doesn't really happen until the 20s and 30s and 40s. So someone like Burroughs has a lot of freedom to cross genres. And I think we still continue to see that today. In fact, we're seeing a lot more science fantasy. I'm thinking of an author like Jeff Vandermeer, whose novel, I can't remember which one it was, Born, I think, was the Southern Reach trilogy, were the model for Annihilation, which came out a little while ago. And that was definitely a weird movie, sort of science fictional, had scientists in it, but you also have this sort of fantastic outgrowth from an alien zone of some sort. So we're seeing a real mixing of the genres. I think even something like Harry Potter is pure fantasy, but except that the magic is treated like a science, right? So a lot of overlap there. It's a form, you can study it, you can learn it, you can get a degree in it, you can apply it, all that good stuff.
And what is the function of what you do, the study of science fiction as an academic field?
So I think there are a couple different reasons this is an important field to study. One of the most important things for me, especially as a faculty member at Georgia Tech, is that looking at stories about science and technology and society really can help scientists and engineers understand how the public receives and understands and processes the kinds of work they're doing. There are really practical reasons why this is important for scientists. When you apply for grants, especially large government-funded grants, you have to be able to address the impact of your science and technology on society. And so essentially you have to spin a little science fiction story, right? So it's interesting for my colleagues to look around to see how their work has been represented in science, and then to think about, as they're writing grants, how much do they want to play into those stories? How much are they trying to move the story around? So there can be a practical reason for this. We also, of course, like to find ways that the scientists and engineers at Georgia Tech can engage with science fiction and use it as a point of inspiration to think about new ways of not just new sciences and technologies to create, but new ways of deploying them and new ways of using them for the benefit of all. Our motto is progress and service. So I like to think that we do science fiction events that help our scientists and engineers fulfill that goal of.
And you've written that it often the science fiction comes before the science.
Often, yeah, absolutely. This was something that we really saw. I was working on a grant on nanotechnology with some of my engineering and public policy colleagues. And when we started the grant, the scientists were very convinced that they already knew how this was going to roll. They're like, well, this is really obvious how this works. Ideas go from science and then they're implemented in public policy, and then people react to them in popular culture. And I said, oh, okay. That sounds like a very simple and elegant model. Let's see if that holds out to be true. And of course, it turned out to not be even remotely true. And in fact, we found that people were writing stories about Jonathan Swift was essentially writing about issues of scale and perspective. And so sort of anticipating.
Gulliver's Travels.
Yes, exactly, right? We found that there were
But you just mentioned a writer who goes back before Mary Shelley.
Yes, well, there was, of course, science fiction before Shelley. Shelley made it popular. She showed you how it could be done, not just as a philosophical experiment or as a way to explain a scientific principle, which was how a lot of scientists were using science fiction originally. But she made it for the masses. She made it popular. And really something that reflects popular hopes and fears about science and technology rather than being a sort of educational tool for scientists themselves.
I would think that Gulliver's Travels was too. I mean, and that goes back at least 100 or 150 years before Shelley, right?
Right, right, right. I think because the whole book isn't focused solely on scientific and technological development, it's got certainly aspects of that, and it's exploring sort of science fictional themes that we could talk about it as a kind of proto-science fiction, absolutely. But it doesn't have the sort of sharp focus that we get in Mary Shelley, which is just an absolute deep dive into what happens when you do science wrong.
Got it. Yeah. What would you say would be the first science fiction? I mean, if you go all the way back.
Some people will tell you Plato's Allegory of the Cave is the first science fiction story. I find that intriguing, but not necessarily convincing. To me, science fiction has grown up with modern sciences and technologies and industrial practices. We can see stories all over the world from all different kinds of cultures about alien visitations, about dream travel to other planets. So people are imagining sort of what we would now call science fictional scenarios since the moment we basically invent storytelling, I have a feeling. But a modern version that really articulates with contemporary science and technology, I'd have to say it's Johann Kepler's Somnium, which is from, I think, the 1600s. Yes, I'm pretty sure. And Somnium, which means dream, was a science fiction novel that actually accompanied a mathematical treatise that Kepler had done. And Kepler had done work in math proving something about the rotation of the moon. And math at that time was written out in longhand rather than in the standard mathematical equations we have now. And there was no standardization from school to school and country to country. So he was very, very worried that people wouldn't understand the math that he was proposing for the mechanics of how the moon works or moves around us. So he wrote a science fiction story. The mathematical treatise was 60 pages long. He wrote a science fiction story that was literally twice as long to explain the math to people. And I think that's the first science fiction story, really.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it
is. I want to take it into this step from the Newtonian Cartesian version of science to the next version. But let me do a brief station ID first, okay? So a little pause for the video here. So when I'm editing the audio, I can have it all and just find it. And my guest for this show is Lisa Yaszek. She's a professor of science fiction studies in the School of Literature, Media, and Communication at Georgia Tech. And she's got a new book out, The Future is Female, 25 Classic Science Fiction Stories by Women, from Pulp Pioneers to Ursula Le Guin. So as I was saying, science has shifted. Science has shifted because of the need to explain subatomic particle physics and quantum theory and complex ecosystems from a Cartesian, Newtonian, mechanistic, atomistic model that looks at parts of things and looks at the world as like a machine to a systemic systems uncertainty principle, chaos theory model. Is science fiction going along for the ride?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
I would think that James Cameron's Avatar did that.
Yeah.
He created a world that was a complete system. He took the Gaia concept, and he just fleshed it out beautifully. I can't wait till his next one. It's supposed to be next year, but he keeps on pushing it back. But
well, hopefully it'll come out soon. I know. Yeah, Avatar was great, and what a great use. I just like to say for a minute of 3D technology too. I think it's the first time I've actually really felt it was used in a sophisticated way that helped with the world building really persuasively. So I think that that's a great example. But we also see that in things like The Matrix, right? The Matrix is all about built systems. Those movies are old now, but they were pretty exciting when they came out. And they really kind of blew people's minds, right? Like this idea that even though print science fiction had been exploring built worlds, virtual worlds for a while, you hadn't seen it as much in science fiction. Maybe Tron does that for us. And then the Matrix movies, now it's a lot more common to imagine these virtual worlds. Or even dream worlds, like a movie like Inception, where you can go into people's dreams and there are whole systems of dreaming that you have to negotiate. Yeah, we absolutely do see that in science fiction. I think it's interesting that this is happening at the same time that science fiction is going global, and that people are also thinking about how to bring in indigenous and alternate modes of science that often actually map a lot better to some of the new things that we're even discovering in Western science.
Indigenous. Talk about indigenous in science fiction.
Okay, go ahead.
That's another fun area that I say fun, but I think that We need to understand that. I always think of the Star Trek movie where they have to go back and find a whale to understand the language because whales went extinct. And I think that the same kind of idea is true with the indigenous wisdom that we're losing as we lose our indigenous cultures.
Yeah, well, I think you definitely see authors of color trying to bring that into science fiction and imagining futures that really bring together the best of the West and the rest, for lack of a better way of putting it. But to think about, so for instance, someone like Misha Noga, who I'd mentioned earlier, who's of she's an indigenous American, I can't remember exactly which nation she's from right now, or someone like Nalo Hopkinson, these are people who are pulling on the scientific practices associated with Jamaican culture, with certain kinds of indigenous cultures, and trying to bring that together to imagine what that might be like. So for instance, Nalo Hopkinson tries to imagine in, is it Midnight Robber, I think, that she imagines a future where we have a whole virtual universe that is indeed controlled by an AI, but that artificial intelligence, it's not like the cold, evil, mysterious war kinds of intelligences we often get in Western science fiction. Its name is Granny Nanny, and it's a grandma, and it's based on these sort of mythological grandmas out of Caribbean storytelling. And it functions very differently, and it creates a very different kind of society than you see happen in other kinds of science fictions, because it's compassionate and it cares about the people that it serves, and it wants to integrate with them and help them become better. It's exciting, it's cool. And so bringing in maybe values as well as practices, but there are certainly authors who are going to do that.
You just answered, that's where I wanted to go next. I wanted to talk about values.
Yes.
Values. The question is, does science fiction tend to have a more liberal or conservative perspective? And what are the values that science fiction writing tends to encourage?
Right. So science fiction is a big tent, and it encompasses every kind of political value you can possibly imagine. Not only we can see this in the West, where we've had authors who are everything from someone like Newt Gingrich, who's a very sort of conservative Republican who writes science fiction, he writes time travel stories, actually. I've never read them, but I know other authors who have, and apparently they're quite good. So he's smart and he knows history and he can think logically, right? So you'll have someone like that, but then you might have someone like Robert Heinlein, who espoused a very early mode of libertarianism. You have traditions of women embracing different kinds of feminism, for instance. A friend and colleague of mine named Minister Faust, he's a Canadian author. He very much thinks about how he might bring together some of like the more progressive politics that he grew up with, along with some of the more kinds of traditional politics that he knows from his family, his dad's family in Kenya. And it's cool to see how people mix this stuff together. So I think the values can be all over the place, and that's something we're actually seeing a lot of argument about right now in science fiction. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but over the past few years, there has been a lot of drama around science fiction's biggest award system, the Hugos. The Hugos are our version of the Oscars. They're sort of like the Oscars and the People's Choice mashed together. They're one of the highest awards you can get in science fiction. They're named after one of the founding editors of the genre, and they're voted on by the fans, by all the people. And that's what's really special about this particular award. It's not given out for artists. Yes, I thought you'd like that. So everyone who attends, who buys a ticket to Worldcon, gets to vote on who's going to win. A few years ago, a couple groups came into science fiction calling themselves either the Sad Puppies, or sometimes they had another name too, I can't remember right now, but we'll call them the Sad Puppies. They were a group of science fiction writers, many of whom had been in the community for a long time. Most are white men. Most are not living in the United States anymore, although they were born in the United States. And most are extremely conservative, and they've been very vocal about their dislike for the state of current science fiction, that they're very unhappy with what they see as a sudden influx of women and people of color who are ruining the fun of the genre for everyone, because they insist on exploring issues of social justice and thinking about inclusion and diversity. And then also, they don't like many of these new authors because they see them as diluting the genre, as bringing in too much fantasy, too many other kinds of traditions, and taking it away from its focus on space and technology and conquest. And you're certainly allowed to have this opinion, of course, and there's lots of room to have these debates, and we've had them before in the science fiction community. We've been, frankly, having this debate since the 1930s, I think.
And yet you mentioned that
Yeah.
for the first time, a three-time Hugo Award winner is a black woman.
Yes, and they went
What's
after
her
her
name again?
specifically. N.K. Jemisin, Nora Jemisin. Yeah, and this group of men, they went after a number of women, but they went after Nora Jemisin specifically. They called her a half-ignorant savage who had no right to be writing.
I think they are. Brett Kavanaugh?
Yeah, and they came in and they exploited a loophole in the Hugo nomination system, and they ended up, for a few years ago, they pushed a lot of their own nominees onto the ballot, and they had created a voting block where it looked like they were going to push through some very minor writers to win very major awards. And what was amazing to me about this is that there was a lot of debate. As you can imagine, people fought back. N.K. Jemisin fights back hugely on social media. The wars that go on are amazing. J.Y. Yang, who's a non-binary author from Singapore, I believe, has also been very vocal and very in the middle of these debates. Fascinating people. And
I have to say, I heard N.K. Jemisin on Cameron's story of
yes.
fiction
series,
and it's the first science fiction novel I've bought in years. You know, because I do this show, I'm constantly reading nonfiction.
Sure. Of course.
A novel in so long, and I'm going to read her book because it looks really exciting.
It is. It's amazing, and I think you'll like it because it's about the way we treat the earth is exactly the way we treat each other, and that sort of connectivity that she explores is very much part of the bottom-up kind of movement you're talking about. So anyway, I want to tell the rest of the bottom-up story.
Yeah, tell the story about the Hugos.
It has a happy ending. It has a happy ending. So the men got violent. There was threats of violence against women. They advocated throwing acid in feminists' faces. They also did this in the gaming community where they doxed a number of female game designers and dumped all their personal information. It was the same group of men who were doing this. And, you know, as in gaming, the community spoke back and basically slapped them down. Every nominee who they put on the slate for the Hugos got either 0 votes or negative votes, because you can negatively vote for someone as being so bad that they're beyond
and
a 0.
We're seeing that right today. We're seeing how Trump and others are attempting to create these artificial victims in young men who are at risk of being accused without a trial, when Kavanaugh never had a worry. He's not being charged.
Exactly.
He's going for a job interview, but that's a whole, so it's a pattern that is reappearing, really.
It is. And it's interesting you bring up Kavanaugh, because I think this is another way we can really think about the influence of science fiction on popular culture, is it gives us the language we have to describe reality, right? So using Google as a verb, that came out of science fiction. The word cyberspace came from science fiction. The words xenobiology and terraforming came from science fiction. And just the other day, I was on social media and someone was talking about the Brett Kavanaugh hearings and started talking about the handmaidening of America. Right, so a reference, so a reference out to Margaret Atwood's *Handmaid's Tale*, right, and a very appropriate reference in a lot of ways. And I thought, wow, the handmaidening of America, it's such an amazing shorthand, and it really makes clear, I think, what the stakes are like in these nominations right now.
Yeah, it's science fiction. To me, it's been an important part of my life. Now, in Cameron's book, an amazing book based on an unbelievable series that I think everybody should watch, the story of science fiction. You did this section on time travel.
I did. That was so fun.
I must confess, I graduated high school when I was 16, and in my child age, before my brain was fully evolved, I got into Penn State University to be an engineering science major so I could invent a time machine. I was so fascinated with time travel. I just love it. And that's what you wrote about. So what does time travel have to teach us?
Oh, time travel shows us so much. It really allows us to explore different modes of society and how they might work compared to each other. It can bring history to life for us in amazing new ways. It can show us really the differences between our own historical period and others. I think Mark Twain's Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court is a wonderful, wonderful example of that. Right? It's a little pessimistic, but it also is a fascinating sort of exploration. What happens when you try to take modern political systems and modern weapons systems back to a different time period, and how that so doesn't work. Another wonderful time travel story is Octavia Butler's Kindred. This is a novel from 1979, I think. It was recently redone as a graphic novel, a beautiful graphic novel by Damian Duffy and John Jennings. And it is a story about a modern Black woman who is pulled back in time to antebellum Maryland, where she finds out she has to help a really, really horrible, rotten, spoiled, evil, and accident-prone white boy who's going to inherit his dad's plantation. She has to make sure he survives to adulthood so he can rape one of her ancestors so she can be born.
Wow.
It's a rough story, yes. And
one that I really like that is kind of a cross-genre one is Ripper Street, which is available on Netflix. And it takes place around the 1890s, where there's a detective and a physician who are using brand new technologies from the 90s to investigate crimes.
That's cool. Yeah, I've been watching the Murdoch Mysteries, which is not science fiction, but does totally that same thing. And it's very much about the most modern detective in the 1890s, essentially. So those kind of stories are cool. I like those. Yeah. So time travel can do these things. It can become a critique of our desire to interfere in the natural world. I think about a story like Ray Bradbury's A Distant Sound of Thunder, which dramatizes the butterfly effect, right? And sort of how it is that through a series of sort of greedy and selfish mistakes, we end up turning, in the story, we end up turning America into actually a right-wing religious theocracy. So I know, very sort of interesting.
And we've got to wrap. We've got
great.
Last words.
Science fiction, the future is female. It really is true. I just would like to stop and say, this stuff matters because it's influenced people to go out and do real good in the world. So I'd just like to point out that astronauts Pamela Melroy and Mae Jemison both talk about how important Anne McCaffrey and Octavia Butler were in shaping their desire to become astronauts. And more recently, I had lunch with a student who's in biomedical engineering. She was actually my research assistant on The Future is Female. And she told me that she's been so inspired by the work we're doing that she's decided to to work in reproductive technologies and to work on creating affordable reproductive technologies that can be distributed to women across the world. Because she said, and this is amazing, she said to me, if I've learned anything from working with you and reading all these stories, it's that no one's going to change the future for women if we don't do it for ourselves. I just thought, amazing. It was amazing. And for a moment, the future was really female in like the best of all possible ways.
You've been listening to Lisa Yaszek. She's the author of a new book, The Future is Female. Thanks so much, Lisa.
Thanks so much, Rob. It's been a pleasure.